Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee and by thee, be happening through Christ our Lord. Amen. Mother most sorrowful, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. So today the topic of the conference is Our Lady of Sorrows, or the Most Sorrowful Mother, and woundedness. And I want to, before we get to actual discussion about wounds, I think I want to lay out just a little bit about some aspects of the life of Our Lady, which give us an indicator of how we're supposed to approach our own woundedness. Because all of us are wounded by varying degrees. Hopefully none of us are wounded in any kind of grave fashion, although there are often people that are. But we're all wounded in various ways by things that happened to us in the course of our life, things that our parents did, or things that other people did to us, or even what we've done in relationship to ourselves, which I'll talk about. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about Our Lady of Sorrows because it helps to set the stage for how we are going to heal from those things. So if you actually look at the sorrows of Our Lady, there's 7 of them. But I want to go through them and just make a few observations about some of them because it gives a sense of her experience in life. I think a lot of times we tend to look at things from the outside, but if we're able to see what was going on in her internally, it gives us a sense of her profound holiness. So in the first sorrow, Our Lady brings with Saint Joseph Christ to Saint Simeon. Now this is also the first joyful mystery, right? So or not the first, it's the fourth. So there's this presentation of Christ, and Our Lady said to one of the saints in a vision that it was a joyful mystery, but then as soon as Saint Simeon told her what we're going to talk about here in just a minute, it immediately turned to sorrow. And so what happens is Saint Simeon says to Our Lady, he says, "Your soul shall be pierced so that the hearts of many will be laid bare." And so we're going to circle around back later about what that actually means concretely, because it actually has a very important role in our own personal spiritual life. But so the first aspect to this is the fact that then Saint Simeon states to her, he then, according to the fathers of the church, even though it's shorthand in the scriptures, he just talks about, Christ this child will be the contradiction and the rise and fall of many in Israel, right? So that's the shorthand that we get of it. But the fathers tell us that he gave Our Lady details down to some of the most minute aspects of what he was going to go through in his passion. So at the time in which Our Lady receives that, probably somewhere in the age of when she was 16 or 17, she receives that information that the son that she just gave birth to, which was a miraculous birth, and then also the fact that it was announced to her by an angel, is going to be put through a brutal death, right? And so she began, from that time on, she had to carry the knowledge of that her entire life, that this is what was going to happen to him. And that this is one of the reasons why the saints refer to her as the Queen of Martyrs, because she died interiorly at that moment, at least in relationship to her son. And this is a profound point because she never once blocked him in that process of leading up to that. In fact, if anything, it's possible that she was actually preparing him through his life and what she was doing as a mother so that he would be able to go through that in a meritorious fashion, in a virtuous way. Okay, so then in the second sorrow, there is the flight into Egypt. It's at that point where Our Lady has perfect confidence in our Lord. This is an important point for us today, because as we see our geopolitical situation deteriorating, and it looks like no one's doing anything to de-escalate us into heading into a pretty bad war. And then also you see in the church there seems to be this decay in the relationship to the hierarchy, where The German bishops just recently approved the blessing of gay unions, which is just absolutely contrary to the gospel. As we see these things beginning to decline, what's happening is that we realize that we might find ourselves in a situation where our situation in the church is going to be such that it's going to require a tremendous amount of trust and confidence on our part in relationship to God to get us through it, right? Then there is the third sorrow, and this is where Christ is back in the temple and he's not in the party that's headed back to Nazareth. So there's this indicator that he's gone. And so Our Lady sorrows that of his absence. This is the precursor to what she's going to suffer in the sixth and the seventh sorrow, specifically the seventh sorrow. And so this is the precursor to that, where she sorrows at his absence. It wasn't that she was afraid or that she was anxiety-ridden or what have you. She was sorrowing that he wasn't there. The fourth sorrow then is when Our Lady sees Christ on the way to Calvary. And by this time he's been scourged, he's been crowned with thorns. According to the fathers of the church, if you ever see that printout that they did of the Shroud of Turin, it's a 3D printout that they did of Christ's body. He was a magnificent man. You just see him, he's large, well-built, beautiful. I mean, he's a magnificent man, right? And yet they said that by the time Our Lady saw him on the way to Calvary, he was so beaten so badly that it was beaten beyond recognition, they said. And so this gives us kind of an indicator of, at that moment, she saw this, everything that that Simeon had told her, at that moment she surrendered to it, she accepted it, she was willing to die to herself. But at this point, there's almost a completion, in a certain sense, of the sacrifice that she was about to undergo, because of the fact that it's at that moment that she has to be willing to turn away from what she wants, her own desires, the well-being of her son. She has to be willing to let loose of that in order for this sacrifice to be completed. And so there's a perfect dying to herself at that moment when she sees this. Then we get to the fifth sorrow, and it's in the fifth sorrow that I want to kind of make an observation that one time I had a case for the demon who was possessing him. He had actually seen Our Lady's interior life at the first instance of his creation. So if you actually look at what happens when angels are created, they call it the three instances. The first instance is that they're created, the whole hierarchy of angels, literally billions upon billions of angels are instantaneously created in a hierarchy. In that first instance, though, God also created them into a perfect act of knowing. That meant that they knew who God was, what their relationship with him was, what their assigned task was for why he created them. That meant who and what they were, their nature. It also meant they understood their relationship to all the other angels. St. Thomas says that they even saw the temptation or what would happen if Lucifer fell, who they would be under if they fell, but also the punishment if they fell, but then also the reward if they were to, what the reward would be if they were faithful. They saw the totality of that all instantly at once. And then at that moment, St. Thomas says that because they saw that intellectually, there was a concomitant delight in the will in seeing how beautiful that was, that of God's plan. And then they made their choice, which in the second instance. And then the difference between us and angels is that we're pretty stupid, right? We're dumb. I mean, all you got to do is turn on the television and you get a pretty quick indicator of that, right? In fact, it seems like the number of people carrying around weapons-grade stupidity keeps increasing all the time, right? It's like, wow, okay. In fact, one time, this one woman I was watching, I have no idea. This woman, and this gives you an indicator of how dumb we are. This woman she was 15 years old and she was pregnant, and she's telling the interviewer, I don't know how this happened. I'm like, okay, I can't help you, if it's on that level. Okay. that means that as human beings, whenever we make a choice the definition of choice is or a free choice, is an attribute of the will in which the will is able to make a determination between goods. Okay. Now that determination means that when we make a choice, we kind of fix our will in something. And as time goes on, because we're not that bright, that fixedness that we have in relationship to the evil or the good is, it takes time to build up to where we become more and more fixed in it. Right? It doesn't mean we can't commit a mortal sin and therefore determine our eternal destiny, because if we die in the state of mortal sin or in the state of grace, God fixes our wills either in evil or in the good, depending on whether we're in the state of grace or not. Okay, so that's it. But with the angels, because they had perfect comprehension of exactly what they were doing, there was no ignorance, there was no weakness like us who, we see the chocolate and we're like, oh, gotta have the chocolate, right? They're not like that. They had full comprehension of it. That meant that their choice was much freer than ours is. And that means when they made their choice, they fixed their will permanently in that thing, whether it was good or bad. In fact, one time I was dragging this demon through the fact that he was created to have I said, so you were created to have the beatific vision, yeah, and you were created to do this magnificent task, yeah, and you were created to have this wonderful relationship with everybody in heaven, yeah, and I go through all these different things, and then you knew that if you chose against that you'd end up in hell, yeah, you'd never see God, yes, and that you would suffer for all eternity, yes, and you'd do it again, yes. They literally are fixed in that, okay. This is why you hear from time to time today, there has been the resurrection of a heresy that originally came from Origen, but it's called wait a minute, I gotta remember this word. Apokatastasis. It was a heresy that was formally condemned by the Council of Constantinople, which says that in the end, the people in hell will get a second chance or possibly get back into heaven. The church has formally condemned that proposition. Once you're in hell, it's eternal. Right? In fact, one of the things you actually see with demons, in sessions, you can actually make their suffering increase by talking about this is never going to end. The suffering you're undergoing is never going to end. And they recognize that, right? And it causes, just recognizing that it's eternal, it's never going to change, causes them more pain. So then they made their choice. And every single angel will tell you that their fundamental failure was sacrifice. And the reason that it was their fundamental failure is because in their choice, St. Thomas says that they were originally created in this act of knowing. And so they saw all of the perfections that the higher angels and the saints and that God had. And they saw those. And so their sacrifice was that there was one particular perfection that they had to be willing to forego in order to fulfill their task. And if they sacrificed that to God, if they were willing to turn away from that, then God would actually reward them with eternal life. The third instance means that once they made their choice, they were immediately damned, or they had the beatific vision immediately. That's a pretty quick succession of things, right? And so, right off the bat, they're either experiencing the pain of loss or they're enjoying the beatific vision. They're still in each other's presence for a little while. And this is one of the reasons why at a certain point God, and there's this battle that goes on in relationship to each other for a while, and then God gives St. Michael the power to cast them all into hell, right? So this is one of the things that happens. So why am I going into this? Well, first of all, if you look at, so I was dragging this demon through this process because he was given at his first instance, because part of his assigned task was to serve Our Lady, he actually got to see her interior life as she was going through the Passion. Okay, so this interior life, he said when he saw it, there was two different demons in this case. They both fell in relationship to the beauty of Our Lady. But he said when he saw this, this interior beauty of Our Lady, it was so absolutely beautiful that he couldn't bring himself to share her even with God. He wanted her for himself, right? And this gives an indicator of how beautiful it was that it took him when he saw this. The other possessor in the case was Beelzebub. Now, Beelzebub is another name for Satan. And he said when he saw that beauty of Our Lady, he knew he would always be second best. He knew that there was no way he would ever achieve that level of beauty, and he wanted that beauty for himself. So at a certain point, I said to Beelzebub, because he'd mentioned that, a little bit later during the sessions, I said to him, I commanded him to tell me, what about her beauty didn't you like? Because he refused God to serve God's will because he had given Our Lady this beauty and he didn't give it to him. And I said, what about it didn't you like? And he said, well, it was the purity of her beauty. I'm like, well, that's a pretty broad statement. And then I said, well, what about the purity of her beauty didn't you like? He said, it was the purity of her love. And I'm like, well, that's a pretty broad statement too. What is it about the purity of her love that you didn't like? He said, it was the fact that when she sacrificed herself to God, she never once counted the personal cost. That means that Our Lady is different from every single individual sitting in this church. We always count the personal cost. We think about how much we're going to suffer when we have to give up something, right? I mean, as an exorcist, a lot of times I'll tell people to start fasting, and then all of a sudden you get the wailing and gnashing of teeth. Oh, Father, I can't do this. You're just like, it's not that hard, right? The point being is that we count the personal cost, even in our own personal relationships. You see this even in marriage, where people are, there's the relationship, and to kind of circle around a little bit to that in relationship to woundedness, is that they're calculating how much they're willing to give their spouse based on how much it's going to hurt, right? Okay. So then he said, and it wasn't just the fact that she never counted the personal cost. He said that basically she never, any time God asked her of anything, she never took herself into the accounting of the equation of what was to be done. She just said yes, she just did it, right? So there's this complete selflessness in that process. So in that sense, she's different from all of us. She's different from every other human being because we count the personal cost. But then he said, and it wasn't just that. It was the fact that she did it over and over and over again and never counted the personal cost once. That means that not only is she different from all of us, she's different from every single saint. She's different from every single angel in heaven. All of the angels, in fact, he said, what made me so angry was the fact that she got to sacrifice herself over and over and over again, and I only got to sacrifice myself once. And so he said, knowing that, I knew I could never achieve the level of her interior beauty. Now notice what he's saying. One is that there's no angel that's like her either. This is why the saints say that the sanctity of Our Lady, well, let's just back up a bit. St. Louis Marie de Montfort says that a single sigh from Our Lady is more meritorious than all the martyrdoms and all of the prayers, sufferings, and good works of all of the saints combined. And the reason being is because there is no one who sacrificed, other than her son, who sacrificed herself in that manner. No one. And this is, and in fact, the saints say that even her sanctity is greater than all of the saints and all of the angels combined. This tells you something about her, that if God ultimately had to choose between us, the totality of all of creation, and her, he would choose her. Because she is the most magnificent creature, other than Christ, that walked the earth, that was created. He had a particular predilection for her. She was different from everybody else. So when you hear people say, oh, we're just like Our Lady, I'm like, oh, shut up. Part of it is it's quasi-blasphemous, frankly. Okay. But the other aspect of it too is that if you notice, so he was indicating that there's no one like her. But it also meant that he was saying that it was through sacrifice that interior beauty was made magnificent, or that's what was consummate in the, it was what made us beautiful interiorly. And so all of the angels and all the saints, and especially the demons, when they're under duress in session, especially the demons particularly, they'll all admit, so all the angels and saints were successful in the fact that they sacrificed this thing, whereas all the demons, even in session, will admit that the one fundamental failure that they made was to sacrifice. St. Thomas says that the one thing that God wants from every intelligent creature is the sacrifice of his will to him, to God. Okay. So at a certain point, I said something dawned on me, because the thing that Beelzebub was beefing about, one of the titles he was unhappy about in relationship to Our Lady, was Spectrum Justitiae, mirror of justice. Well, justice is the virtue by which we render someone their due. That's its definition. Underneath that is a sub-virtue, a virtue of religion. That's where we render God his due. And we owe God certain matters in justice. This is one of the reasons why the saints say if you're not praying at least 15 minutes a day, you're failing in just the most elementary obligations of justice to God. Underneath the virtue of religion is 4 different kinds of acts, but the one I want to focus on is the act of sacrifice. And an act of sacrifice has 3 components. We see this in the Old Testament. It's how God structured and designed it. It's in the Old Testament. It's actually seen in Christ. It's seen in every single one of us when we sacrifice. It's actually seen at Mass. Every single sacrifice has these 3 elements. The first is the offertory, which means there's 2 parts to the offertory. The first is you have to be willing to turn away from, basically willing to turn away from some good and give it to God. So that's the 2 parts. Turn away from it and give it to God. And in giving it to God, then it becomes his, and it's something that's not ours, right, anymore. The second part, and this is one of the reasons why they say, if a priest does the offertory and then collapses at Mass, well, you haul him off and you bring in another priest to actually finish the Mass. Right? And the reason you do that is because of the fact that the oblata, those are the things that have been offered, are sitting on the altar, and they've been segregated out and given to God, and so we have to properly take care of them. We can't just leave them there. We can't use them for something else. Then the second component is the slaying of the victim. And so with Christ, it was actually the dying upon the cross. And then there is the consuming of the victim, right? And this is why the priest receives Holy Communion. So what happens is in the sacrifice, and this is what they used to always tell people, you have to offer it up, right? So when you have a suffering, and then modernists in the 70s would say, oh, that's just ridiculous and that's not helpful. Oh, no, quite the contrary. By taking our suffering, what we do, and when we offer, we're technically speaking not offering our suffering to God, we're offering our willingness to suffer to him and accepting this suffering in our life, okay? And so by that, then, in the end, we're turning away from the particular created good of our comfort, what we want, what we desire, etc. We're turning away from that and turning towards God, and we're giving our wills to him, okay? So at a certain point, I said to Beelzebub, because he was complaining about this, her title of Mirror of Justice, and he just got done telling me all these things about how she was so sacrificial, which is that act of religion and justice. I said to him, because she was the mirror of justice. So I said to him, what you really saw when you saw her interior beauty was him, wasn't it? And he said, yes, that's why I wanted to be God. I wanted his beauty for myself. It wasn't about the power. It wasn't about the ability to subvert the order that he had established. It was about that beauty. I wanted it for myself. And he said, and because he wouldn't give it to me, I spat on him. Very interesting, huh? And it tells us something, that tells us something about God. And there's a whole analysis as to why sacrifice is beautiful, but if you actually look at it, it's sacrifice that makes us like God. It makes us like Christ, obviously, who is God, but it also makes us like God the Father. And this is how it is. God doesn't himself offer sacrifice because of the fact that if he's God, and sacrifice is something that's offered to God, so he doesn't offer something to himself. Although his son, he did from all eternity choose to allow his son to be sacrificed for our sake. And so there's an eternity to that willingness to allow his son to be sacrificed. And that means that with God the Father, that there was a willingness to turn away from the created good of his son's earthly life for the sake of offering sacrifice to him, or offering to him that good so that we could have salvation. Okay? And so there's that willingness on that. But then there's another aspect to it too. And that is, God created this world for his manifestation of his own glory. This is one of the reasons why every time you sin, you're a thief. And you're a thief because you've stolen from God something that's rightly his glory. So every time you sin, you create disorder in his creation, and as a result of that, you have to pay it back, right? This is why we have to make reparation. But it also means that God is willing to allow us, he's willing to turn away from the created good, he's willing to suffer detriment in relationship to his external glory for the sake of our salvation, or for a greater glory. And how do we know this? Well, if you think about this, if every single human being in the world only committed one venial sin a day, it would mean that God is offended 7 billion times a day. So the next time you get a hangnail, I'm not interested in hearing about it. But the point being is, and that's just, we also know that the number of mortal sins is off the charts. People are committing mortal sins at a rate that are just so offensive to him. We always hear about the rights of man and how men are suffering, and that's all true. But the fact of the matter is that no one is talking about the gargantuan amount of offense that he has taken by how evil our world has become. Right? And yet, he was willing to forego that. That was the beauty, Beelzebub said, that he saw in God the Father. That willingness to suffer the detriment to his external manifestation of his glory for the sake of our well-being, for the sake of a higher good. Okay, so why does sacrifice what's this got to do with wounds and healing? Okay, well, there's a bit of an explanation that's required. So I first wanted to lay out that Our Lady went through this tremendous suffering, right? And that she was willing to sacrifice. And even in Calvary, she didn't count the personal cost. That was not her focus. Her focus was entirely on God during that process. So this demon says at the fifth sorrow, I commanded him to tell me what was going through her when she was at the foot of the cross. And he basically revealed that God had given her a grace to recognize that this was a sacrifice that only she could offer. It was something that he was asking of her particularly. And this is true. She's the only one that can submit to her son being put to death brutally. And she not only suffered the pain of seeing her own son put to death, but she knew him like no other individual. She knew he was absolutely innocent. And yet she had to watch an innocent person being brutally put to death. And yet she was willing to do that. Then I commanded him to tell me what was going through her in the sixth sorrow. And he said, Consummating est. Now this is a woman that's possessed, she doesn't know Latin. She doesn't know hardly any theology. In fact, the demon's nickname for her is the stupid woman. What's interesting, though, is they get their comeuppance even when they do that. So one time, they were haranguing her, telling her how dumb she was and how dumb she was. And she admits she's not that bright, right? Which tells you something about her humility. But at a certain point when they were haranguing her, she finally just turned to the demons and said, I might be stupid, but at least I'm not foolish. Shut them up. All right. Now this consummatum est, as I mentioned, in a sacrifice, Christ's sacrifice begins at the Garden of Olives. When he says to God the Father, he makes the offertory, not my will, but thine be done. That's the offertory. Then the slaying of the victim is the brutal passion that he goes through. And that passion, we see in this in the book of Isaiah, but we also see it in St. Paul. But there's a mentioning of the fact that all of the sufferings, that each individual suffering that Christ went through was to be able to merit our healing and to merit the overcoming of the punishments due to the fall of Adam and Eve and for our sin. And then he himself said, when he's on the cross, at a certain point when he's on the cross, they hand him, or they put up to him the sponge that has this the gall in it, which would cut the pain that he's suffering in, but he turns away from it. And the reason he turns away from it is because he's turning away from the delight of the fruit of the tree. He's undoing that particular aspect of the fall of Adam, who ate the fruit. And so after that, he says, consummatum est, which means everything that, all of the merit that was necessary to merit the totality of our healing was finally complete. And then he gives up his life, right? But Our Lady, her consummatum est is when she, at the sixth sorrow, when they take Christ down from the cross and she embraces him, which is an indicator that she fully accepts. It's complete now. Her sacrifice is complete by embracing her son's death in a complete fashion. So then she goes to bury Christ, and in the seventh sorrow, and I commanded the demon what was going through her in that, and he said, finitum est. Now that distinction between consummatum est and finitum est is a distinction that liturgists used to make in the 1900s. It's one of those distinctions that, unless you're someone like me who has trifocals from reading excessively, you're unlikely to know this distinction. In fact, there's hardly anybody on the planet that knew it, but the demons knew it. We actually see that in the old Bride of Mass, that distinction. The priest consumes communion, that's the consummatum est. That's the completion of the ritualistic sacrifice in the Mass. But the ritual isn't finished yet. And so when you get to the part of the Mass before the Placet Sancta Trinitas, which is one of the last prayers the priest said before he blesses people, before that he turns to the people and he says, Ite missa est. Now, the phrase ite missa est does not mean the Mass is ended. That was just a bad translation. It actually means it is sent. And it refers to the fact that after the priest receives Holy Communion and everything is finished, and he says the post-communion, that the sacrifice of the Mass has been sent to God, and it's therefore finished. That's the finitum est of the actual Mass, but it means it's been sent. And it's after that, for the first time, that the word obfere, which means to offer in the Mass, is in the past tense. It's been sent. It's been offered, okay? It's at this point that Our Lady at the tomb realizes that everything, all of the suffering and pain that God had asked of her is now finally finished. All the things she knew that was going to happen to her son, all these things, this pain she carried for her entire life was now finally finished. And yet we refer to all her sorrows as sorrows. In all of the corpus of the Church's prayers, there's only one prayer that I'm aware of where they refer to Our Lady's sorrows as vulnera, wounds. But if you read the context of the prayer, they're not talking about Our Lady being wounded. Our Lady was never wounded. It's not like after the Passion, she has to sit down with a therapist and go through a few things. She didn't do that. Why? For the longest time, I was wondering to myself, why is it that Our Lady wasn't wounded through all of that? And so what what I began to do is I had written a couple of books, and in those books I was actually unpacking what the nature of a wound is. So a wound is when some external agency acts upon us and or on something, and it causes damage, right? And then in that damage is also pain. And that pain requires a certain healing process in order to undo. So that's kind of the general structure of a wound. And so Our Lady, for the longest time, I'm like, why wasn't she wounded in this? We also see this just in her general psychology, right? So then one day I'm reading St. Thomas Aquinas on wounds, and he says, a thing can only be wounded when there's resistance to the thing causing the damage. Now, this is actually true. So if you take a knife, right, and you press it on your hand, but you don't create any resistance on your hand, it stings a little bit, but it doesn't penetrate. It's only when I create the resistance can the knife then penetrate, right? And so what this tells us is that in physical wounds are very much like psychological wounds and also spiritual wounds, that we only become wounded because there's resistance to the pain. There's resistance to the suffering. Our Lady never resisted the suffering. She fully embraced every single sacrifice, every single painful thing, and never once counted the personal cost. And that's another way of saying there was never any resistance to anything God ever asked of her. If you notice, what's happening is anytime she's asked, her immediate answer is yes to God. One point, there was this one demon was talking about how beautiful she was. And so I said to him, so basically when God saw how beautiful was, he gave himself to her, and he says, no, you have the order wrong. So whenever they flatly correct you, that's usually an indicator they're telling you something that's true. And so I said, then what was the right order? He said, when she saw how good he was, she couldn't help but give herself entirely to him. And the way the indicator for that is Our Lady did have a mystical life leading up to the time of the Annunciation. She did actually have, a mystical experiences from time to time during that phase. In fact, they say that Our Lady was confirmed in grace. She was at the 8th level of prayer prior to the Annunciation. And that confirmed in grace, or that preservation in grace, was in point in fact that God kept her from falling into sin. And then once she accepted the fiat, that is, she accepted what God was asking and gave the fiat, then at that moment she entered into a confirmation in grace, which means she couldn't sin from that point on. But it's at that moment that she gives herself entirely to them. This is when the mystical marriage between our Lord and Our Lady is perfect and complete, because she now becomes a spouse of the Holy Spirit, okay? So that meant that when she saw how good he was, we see this with ourselves. One of the worst experiences that you can have as a priest is going to a convent where the nun that runs it, the mother that runs it, is so holy and so good, and she starts asking you of stuff and you just can't tell her no, right? So it's just, she's actually just like, if I tell her no, this is terrible, right? Well, it's the same thing in relationship to Our Lady, that she realized there's no way I can tell him no, and she just gives him everything. She also sees in how good he is that she is nothing in comparison to him, and so why would she count the personal cost? Okay. So then she never once, in counting the personal cost, she never resisted, and this is why she was never wounded. She suffered tremendously. In fact, Our Lady's suffering is far beyond anything we're even capable of comprehending. The nature of virtue is such that it actually causes an acuteness in our faculties. What does that mean? It means that the body adjusts itself to the operations of the soul. Now, we know this to be true. That is, as we act as our soul acts through our body, the body begins to adjust to it. Now, we know this by virtue of the fact that if you see some guy and he's 300 pounds and he's sitting on a couch and he says, I'm going to run a marathon, and he gets up, half a block later, here comes the ambulance and the stretcher hauls him off. But over the course of time, he starts dieting, he loses weight, and then he starts exercising more and more and more. And then slowly over the course of time, his body begins to adjust to his exercise and what he's doing, and then eventually he gets to run the marathon. This is true even about virtue. Virtue does the same thing, because it begins to adjust the body's disposition to accommodate the acts of virtue. This is why people who fast often find that the next time they eat, things are much more flavorful, or that even their sense of touch begins to be heightened if they fast enough. Okay. And so Our Lady, because her entire life she never committed sin, and because she was created in the state of grace, because she was immaculately conceived, it meant two things. It meant, one, that every single action that she did voluntarily, because she was doing it because she loved God, meant that it was meritorious. So every single thing she ever did raised her place in heaven. And it increased her grace. This is why she's so far beyond the rest of us. Every time we sin, we cut that down, we stop, we block that, we're not faithful to the graces, etc. The second part, it meant every single time she performed a voluntary act, it increased her virtue. It meant when she entered into heaven, she had the plenitude of every single virtue. And this is something that's why her magnificence is so profound. In fact, the demon, at one point, I said to him, because it was the Feast of the Annunciation, I said, I basically commanded him to give glory to God for that this was Our Lady's most glorious feast. And again, he looks at me, nah, it wasn't, right? So then I commanded him, well, what was it? He said, that was her moment of greatest triumph. And it's true, because that means that she entered into heaven, as St. Paul said, he ran the course, he fought the good fight, etc. But she had gotten into heaven sinless, and she had conquered Satan in the process of that. But then I said, well, then what was it? Was it her crowning of Queen of Heaven and Earth? That was her most glorious moment. He says, no, that was her moment of greatest honor. Now, honor is the praise and recognition that we give to excellence. There's something excellent or good about the individual. And this was God honoring Our Lady, who was letting us and moving everybody into heaven to see, to be able to give us the recognition of her excellence, than this crowning that he gave to her, because she was different from everybody else. So at a certain point, I just told him, well, what was it? And he said, standing beneath the cross in perfect virtue. At a later moment, he said that her standing beneath the cross, aside from her son, was the most glorious moment in all of history. This gives us a sense of it, right? There's no one like her. There just isn't. This is one of the reasons why one time I received a grace. I don't know, at least I think it was a grace, but it was just a grace where Our Lady basically was telling us, quit doing things to make me like you and just love me, right? I'm worthy just to be loved, which is true, right? But the point being is that this magnificence and this virtue, it's virtue also that keeps us from getting wounded. The more virtuous we are, the more we can sustain this. What does this mean? So we become wounded because we resist it. It means we don't suffer well. We don't want to suffer, and we hold on to something that we don't. There's some good that we want to protect. So when someone sticks a knife in us, the first thing that happens is we grab the knife. And the reason we grab the knife is because we don't want more damage to be caused. And we're also trying to minimize the pain. Now, when you got the knife in you got one of two choices. You either can hold on to the knife and minimize the pain as much as you possibly can, although you're still in pain. But over the course of time, it's just going to fester and get worse, and it's going to kill you eventually. Or you can pull it out. Now, if you pull it out, we all know this, that when we pull something out, that because we're wounded from it, it's brutal, right? The first initial pulling out is really, really painful. There's a spike in pain. And then, but once we pull it out, the pain begins to subside, and then it can begin to heal, right? Well, what that basically means is that when we're holding on to the knife, St. Thomas calls that contraction. We do this even in relationship to our spiritual and psychological wounds. We see this in marriage. When one spouse hurts the other spouse, the first thing the one spouse does is they do this contraction. They hold on to the knife. What's the knife? The injustice that the person committed. And so, because of that injustice, because this person did this injustice, now they're hurt. There's damage that's been caused. And so they hold on to that justice that they should have given them. You should have done this. But then also we see this even in relationship to our own woundedness. When we commit a sin that we're particularly shameful or particularly feel bad about, then a lot of times people will hold on to, I should have been better. I'm going to return to that in a minute. But then we have a choice to make in relationship to that woundedness. But the good that the person is holding on to is they're trying to minimize the pain. They're trying to hold on to comfort, emotional comfort and emotional satisfaction and contentment, rather than actually embracing the emotional pain. If you notice, Our Lady fully embraced the pain. We see this. That's why she holds her son afterwards, after he's put to death. And that's why she was never wounded. It's holding on to that justice that should have been, and it's also holding on to the emotional comfort, excuse me, which is why we're actually wounded. That's why we're wounded, because we're unwilling to suffer. And we create resistance in relationship to the thing. This is one of the reasons why we even see this in marriage. What happens in marriages is when one spouse hurts another spouse, the person begins this contraction, and a wall starts to slowly be built up between the two of them. Because in marriage, St. Thomas says, is the most intimate of relationships. And that means that because it's more intimate, to be intimate, you can't have any barriers between yourselves. The more intimate we are with people is a sign that there's less and less things between us. So that means that the hearts of each other can have that perfect union, but that also means that you are vulnerable in relationship to the other person because they could easily hurt you. In fact, I always tell men, the one person you have to protect your wife from the most is you, because he's the one that is most capable of hurting you. It's the same thing even in relationship to the wife to the husband. But once they start hurting each other, if they're unwilling to suffer in relationship to their spouse, if they're unwilling to, over the course of time, that contraction occurs, and then the injustices start building up in the person's mind, and they hold on to it, and the walls begin to be built up. This is why forgiveness is so important, because what forgiveness is forgiveness is letting loose of the debt of the justice that the person owed you. They should have treated you better. This also, and so we have to be willing to let loose of this. Christ said, forgive 7 times, 70 times. You have to always forgive, if for no other reason than for the love of God. But there also means that you have to be willing to forgive for your sake. Everybody in heaven, because if you're holding on to that injustice, you're in pain. And you think about those things, and they cause you pain. It gets you mad, it gets you worked up, etc. Everybody in heaven has forgiven everybody that's hurt them. Everybody in hell has forgiven no one. And so literally, by our lack of forgiveness, we create our own hell, even in this life. And so if you want heaven, you just have to start forgiving and let loose of that. And then once you let loose of that debt of justice, the hurt that that person caused you, you can begin healing. Your relationship in marriage can begin healing. So forgiveness is one of the principal ways that we begin the healing process. You have to forgive these other people. This is an important point because, and I've seen some of the most impressive levels of forgiveness. I've dealt with women who were possessed because they were victims of satanic ritual abuse. A lot of that was sexual in nature. They were raped and molested in a variety of different ways. And yet, God gives them the grace to fully forgive. You see a significant change interiorly in the healing process once you're able to forgive the person that did this to them. And you ultimately have to forgive it for your sake, so that there's nothing between you and God. ultimately. If you're holding on to that particular thing, it means you're unwilling to sacrifice it. You're unwilling to turn away from that created good and turn towards God, the created good being this justice that you are owed. At a certain point, Beelzebub says to me, because in this case, it was a protracted case. It lasted numerous years. In the very beginning, he said, the reason for this case is so that I will be fully exposed. Didn't pay much attention to it, just made a mental note of it. And right towards the end, in which the woman was getting liberated, the demons actually, he said to me, at a certain point during, I was saying Mass and the woman was in attendance. This is just before the session. And he full-blown manifests during Mass. And so I finished Mass. Afterwards, we started the session. I said this series of prayers to clamp down on him so he doesn't engage in bad behavior. And then I said to him, he told me you had to tell me something, didn't he? And he kind of nods yes, but he's just really angry. And I told him, shut up. You are not permitted to talk. And the reason I did that is to make sure that he understands that he only gets to talk when I say he can talk, because the whole point in exorcism is to build enough authority over the demon to where you can command him to give you the information that's necessary to get him out. So the whole thing is to get him to realize he's not in the driver's seat. And so I just beat him around for 45 minutes. And the whole time you could tell him, was like, I got to get through this so I can just say this thing, right? So at a certain 45 minutes later, I said, you have something to tell me? And he said, he told me I had to reveal my nature. I said, let's hear it. He said, my nature is that I convince people that they cannot be separated from the particular good. He says, it's how I subvert sacrifice. He then went on to say, it's how I took Adam and Eve out. It's how I took your government out. It's how I'm taking the church out. It's how I've taken every single human being out. Very fascinating. As St. Thomas said, the one thing that God wants from every created creature is the sacrifice of his will to him. And that means we have to be willing to turn away from the created good. This is what Our Lady did. She never counted the personal cost. She never looked at herself. She turned away from herself and always turned towards God. She is the exemplar. That's why she's so beautiful interiorly. So this is true even in relationship to our own self-woundedness. There's people, usually by the time they've reached 25, they've done something bad enough to where they feel really bad about it. And usually what happens is that people just start beating themselves up. You know, oh, you're so bad, you're so bad. Okay, look it. The fact of the matter is that's just against charity, because you're supposed to love God. You're supposed to love God and love your neighbor for the sake of God, and you're also supposed to love yourself for his sake. The terminus is not yourself, it's him. That's why it makes it selfless. That love that we have of ourselves becomes selfless when it's for him, St. Thomas says. But it means, though, also that so it's against charity. But the other thing is, too, is it violates the principle of sufficient reason. You're not perfect. You cannot render yourself into a state of perfection, regardless of how much you beat yourself up. There are certain sins for which St. Thomas says we cannot make restitution. There are certain things in your life you are simply not going to pay back to God. And St. Thomas says as a result of that, you simply have to surrender to them those things to him in his mercy. Because God wants his mercy, his glory to be manifest in your life, even in that way. And so how do we become perfect? Because Christ said, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Well, the way we become perfect is we have to cede control over our interior life to him. And then he'll give us the grace. He's perfect, and so he can render us perfect, but that means we have to enter into cooperating with him and not trying to control our own spiritual lives. But that also means that we have to be willing to embrace every single suffering that comes down the pike, because those are opportunities of grace. They're opportunities of healing. They're opportunities of purification, of perfection, and growth in virtue, and raising our place in heaven. Every single one of them. And so He says, I subvert sacrifice. This is exactly what he does with us. The reason none of us in this room are saints, and if you are a saint, you're going to basically, in your humility, because you're a saint, say, yeah, that's true. So you can't say, I can't believe Father would say such a thing. Well, it's like shooting ducks in a barrel, right? Okay. The reason none of us are saints is because there are times in which we held on to the created good and were unwilling to turn away from it. Every one of us. It's the root of every sin we have. It's at the root of every single defect we have. And so if we're going to become like Our Lady, or become like God, we have to actually be willing to turn away from that created good and turn towards him. So that means we have to be willing to forgive ourselves. We have to let loose of the idea, I should have been better. Look it, there is no sin that anyone in this room cannot commit if God retracts his grace. There's no form of sin, even the most depraved forms of sin. There's not an individual in this room that wouldn't commit it if God didn't preserve that person in grace. The Council of Trent stated that no one can stay out of mortal sin even for a short period of time without grace. So you just have to accept two things. One, either you didn't get the grace, or two, you weren't faithful to the grace, and that is, you just going to have to humble yourself and accept the fact that you aren't perfect. It's pure, unadulterated pride to hold on to that I should have been better. No, true humility is, well, that's the way I am, and only God can save me. Okay? So you have to be willing to forgive yourself, and then you can actually begin the healing process. Also, you have to start building virtue. And so as you build virtue, then the faculties, because a woundedness is that our faculties, there's something, we've caused damage to our faculties, and now they don't work right. Right? This is another reason why we have to forgive people, and we have to actually work on our own woundedness, so that our faculties will become rightly ordered. A wound causes damage, and so it is a form of damage. And so as a result of that, every single time we sin, we cause damage to our intellect, damage to our will, damage to our emotions and our appetites. How do we do this? Well, every single time you commit a sin, you make a choice. You know the thing is sinful. The intellect has judged that it's sinful. That's your active conscience. And you decide you're going to ignore this evil, so you move your intellect to ignore the evil and focus only on the good, and that does violence to your intellect, because your intellect was designed and structured by God to know the truth. And the principal effect of violence is weakness. You've weakened your intellect. You dumbed yourself down. And the more you do it, the more dumb you get, right? In fact, that's one of the things that I think that's, when people start growing to a certain level of holiness, one of the things that kind of scares them is how dumb they are. Man, I'm just, and God lets them see that so they become more dependent on grace. Because grace, actual grace, the two principal effects of grace is to enlighten the mind and strengthen the will. Notice it doesn't act on the emotions. It enlightens the mind. It reverses the process. It reverses the damage, so grace can actually heal us. You need to ask our Lord and Our Lady, give me the grace to heal. So Our Lady, who is the mediatrix of all grace, you can ask her, help me to heal. But also help me not to hold on into the injustices like you did. You didn't hold on to the injustice. Help me to be like that through grace. And then it strengthens the will. The will is ordered towards choosing the good. So when you choose evil, you weaken the will. But also you choose, and as I mentioned, you focus on this aspect of it that's good. That's a lesser good than if you did the moral thing. And so every time you choose something in your will, you choose the lesser good. The choosing of the lesser good is the definition of malice. Every single one of us in this room suffers from malice, because we've chosen the lesser good rather than the greater good. And so we have to ask God for the grace to start choosing the greater good. This is sacrifice. Sacrifice is precisely turning away the lesser good and turning towards the greater good. It's the inversion. Sacrifice is the inversion of malice. So Then also, every time we choose something sinful, we incline our emotions and appetites towards that in a disordered way, and now our appetites are out of control. And so the next time this thing comes up, we might intellectually know this is the problem, but emotionally, we're a mess. St. Thomas calls that antecedent appetite. This is the emotions that arise up prior to or contrary to reason, before we have even a chance to think about it. And a lot of times people ask me, well, what virtues do I need to work on? Well, just look at your emotions. Is there any emotion that you have that you don't have perfect control over? If it is, that tells you where your vice is. If you're angry, it means you don't have the virtue of meekness. It's that simple. You don't have your irascible appetite. So if you get angry and you don't want to be angry, or if it's unmoderated, that's an indicator that you have this particular vice. The point being in all of this, though, is that we have to be willing in the pathway to healing is sacrifice. Turning away from that. Turning away from the injustice, turning away from our comfort, turning away from all those things in order to achieve the greater good. The sacrifice, and the sacrifice then plays an absolute key role in the healing and in our spiritual advancement. We have to be willing to sacrifice everything. Everything. St. John of the Cross says that you can have an attachment, which is this being convinced you can't be separated from the particular good. You can't have an attachment for anything that's created whatsoever. That includes your spouse, your home, your retirement, your money, your children, everything. You have to be willing to turn away from all of that. It doesn't mean that you're not acting with them in relationship to charity, but you have to be willing to give it all up, because everybody in heaven, as St. Paul says, God is all in all. He is the only thing. We have to become like Our Lady, where we lose ourselves in Him. We see only Him. That has to be our goal. Then, of course, the healing also begins just by virtue of the fact that as I build virtue, it starts counteracting the damage that I've caused in my faculties. So I have to be willing to work on the virtue. But this sacrifice also means I have to be willing to suffer. If I'm going to heal, if I'm going to achieve perfection, but if I'm going to heal and ultimately be in heaven, I have to be willing to suffer anything that God sends them. So how do we suffer well? Well, there's a few things, and we'll wrap it up with this. The first is there cannot be any resistance to the suffering. We can't be in the habit of turning away from it. When it comes, we have to be, if we have the virtue of mortification, it means that we're actually going to be willing to allow any suffering that God sends into our life. The second is we have to embrace it. This is what Our Lady did. This is why her embracing Christ after the Passion is so important for us. She is the example to show us you have to be willing to embrace the very thing that causes the pain, in order so that it can be conquered and overcome, or that we're able to suffer it well. See, the reason we don't suffer well, the reason we get angry is because, again, we're resisting the thing, and we're not embracing it. So I tell people, look, if your spouse is doing something, or someone in your family is doing something to hurt you, or someone else for that matter, what you have to be willing to do is be willing to turn away from your own comfort and emotional, St. Thomas calls it complacentia, being complacent, or being satisfied in our emotions. We have to be willing to turn away from that and embrace our spouse or the person that's hurting you, who's causing you pain, for their sake. You offered up for them. And in doing that, you're not going to get hurt by what they say or do. And this is something that's important for us to realize. It's only if I embrace the thing that I'm actually not going to be wounded from the process. And I can't heal that until I start pulling out the knife, letting loose of those things. So I have to be willing, and that is, again, turning away from that emotional comfort, being willing to suffer the pain. You have to, in a sense, steer into it, as they say. And that means I have to be willing to embrace the thing that's painful. We know this is true. I'm going to give you an example. I'm not suggesting that it's a good thing, and I'm not at least in its immoderate form. And I'm not suggesting that people should go out and do this. But if you find guys who are very manly, when they see a guy who's effeminate, you ask them, what's your inclination? Every single normal guy will say, I want to beat him. Now, that just sounds disordered, but it's actually not. What it is it's a recognition that as men, we become men by engaging things that are painful. When Adam fell, he ended up becoming subject to the curse of Adam. And basically what that meant is it was a twofold thing. The first, he was irresponsible. And how do we know he was irresponsible? He threw Eve under the bus. Why'd you do this? It was her. Right. This hurt Eve. It means she can't trust him now, that he's going to throw her under the bus. This is also one of the reasons why they say that, before marriage, it's Mr. Right, and after marriage, he can't do anything right. It's also why I tell women, yeah, I know, your husband is the dumbest man to walk the face of the planet. We all know that, right? Okay. But it's why women, that's part of the curse of Eve, by the way, which I'll get to in a minute. But then there is this, so there's this curse of Adam, and then there's the curse of Eve, but the curse of Adam is also, the fathers of the church tell us that one of the sins, Adam committed 8 sins in the fall, and one of the sins he committed was an unwillingness to be separated from the pleasure of his wife. We're not talking about the conjugal act. We're talking about just the fact that men get a pleasure about being around women, and vice versa. He was unwilling to be separated from her. As a result, he became subject to the twofold curse. Now men are irresponsible. This is why the to-do jar is still full of things to do at home. And the second thing is, and this is also why women just drives them nuts, they can't get their husband to do anything. But this is also but the other part of it is that men are prone to effeminacy. Effeminacy, St. Thomas defines it as an unwillingness to put aside one's pleasure in order to pursue what's arduous. Now that's another way of saying painful. And so what did God do? He said to Adam, because you have done this, you will work, which is a way of saying now you have to take responsibility for providing for Eve. Second, in thorns and in pain. So the two principal ways that men man up is by responsibility and pain. And both of those require him to turn away from some particular good. It requires sacrifice. So both of those merge into sacrifice. This is why when a woman sees that her husband will sacrifice anything for her, and he's very sacrificial, she will just love him. She wants to be under him. The opposite is in relationship to the curse of Eve. So in the curse of Eve, what happened? Because Eve took the fruit and ate the fruit, she took headship away from Adam, and then she hands the fruit to Adam, which is a way of trying to control him. And so now the curse of Eve, God says to Eve, your desire shall be for your husband. Has a twofold meaning. One, it means that it's harder for women to be away from their husbands than it is husbands or wives. It's also harder for women to be unmarried than men. But that phrase in Hebrew, the desire for, means the desire to control. And the reason she controls him is because he's not being responsible, etc. But it's this curse of Eve that has happened. And that basically means that the way a woman becomes sacrificial is by dying to the goods that she wants and trying to control him. Women control for one of two reasons. Actually, all of us, if we're controlling, do it for one of two reasons. One is because of fear. He's going to throw me under the bus. He's not going to do it. It's a fear he's not going to do this. And so they try and control him to get out of him, which is the second thing, trying to get out of him what they want. And they have to be willing to die to that. The fathers of the church say that if a woman can conquer that desire to control, so if she can master sacrifice, if you notice Our Lady never once tried to control Joseph, never once tried to control the situation, never. But the fathers say if a woman can conquer that desire to control, there is no virtue that she cannot obtain. And that's why they say a woman who has conquered the curse of Eve is the most magnificent creature to walk the face of the planet. But they also say if she does not conquer it, she will never master any virtue, and she is the most wretched of all creatures. So they have the choice. With men, they got to man up. right? There has to be that continual sacrifice. You see, we all know this, when we see a marriage where both of them, she doesn't control and he loves her, because that's how he sacrifices himself, St. Paul says, husbands, love your wives. If he does that, then we see in that order a beauty, right? And that beauty is the sacrificial dimension that they have to each other. It also means that in relationship to each other, they don't wound each other, and they've also healed in relationship to any wounds that they have in relationship to each other. And they can also, even if they are wounded, they can help each other heal through that by encouraging them to do the things and supporting them, etc. So in the end, it's Our Lady of Sorrows that is her sacrifice, which is the exemplar for our own healing. And so, we'll end with this. You can see why Beelzebub said that she was so absolutely beautiful, I knew I'd always be second best. He would never attain that. But we can emulate Our Lady. We can become little mirrors of her by our own sacrifice, but also being willing to sacrifice in healing. All of us have a requirement to heal. So the thing I want to end with is this. Our Lady of Sorrows, Saint Simeon said, your soul shall be pure so that the hearts of many will be labored bare. So we're circling back around to something I mentioned right in the beginning. And that basically means that because Our Lady stood beneath the cross, she merited an intimacy with God that no other individual has. And he revealed he's like us. To those that we trust, to our close friends, to our family, we tell them things we don't tell other people, and it's the same thing with God. He reveals things to her he does not reveal to other people, but he'll let her reveal it in order to draw attention to her perfections, because he loves her and he wants her to be recognized. And so that means, therefore, that if we pray to Our Lady of Sorrows and ask her to reveal to us, what is our woundedness? What do I need to heal from? What is the vices I need to overcome? Then by asking her to reveal that, she'll give you the grace to see this is what you need to heal from, or this is what the vice that you need to work on. And so she is not only gives us the grace to begin that process of healing, but she also gives us the knowledge and where to go and how to do it. So we really need to turn to her, because she's the one to whom we can finally get the information we need in order to become like everyone in heaven, where we've forgiven everybody and that God is all in all. Okay, we'll stop there and we'll answer some questions.
Okay, the first question. Who are some of the saints besides Mary, St. Joseph, and St. Michael that you have experienced during exorcisms and gotten direct assistance from them?
I don't see them, but it's just that the person who's possessed usually sees them. The one that's probably outside those three, that's the most, is Padre Pio. My nickname for him is Johnny on the Spot, because you just ask him to show up and boom, he's right there, right? And I think it's God's way of giving him satisfaction for having been beat up by demons in this life, right? They get their comeuppance, right? In fact, it's so funny. I mean, he's kind of extraordinary. One time, this one woman, this demon would not sit still. So I just turned to Padre Pio and I said, would you get this guy under control? And all of a sudden, the woman just goes, wham, down on the ground. And she's like writhing around. And afterwards, I asked her, well, what happened? And she said, I don't know, but I could feel his foot on my back. All right. So there's Padre Pio. It just depends on the nature of the case. Every demon has a nemesis. And these nemeses are the result of the person in that, God sets the angel up as the nemesis, or he sets up the saint. And that usually means that there's somebody in this life who has worked hard and conquered the demon in this life. So, for example, it's Catherine of Alexandria is the nemesis of the noonday devil. Our Lady is the nemesis of Satan under the title of Immaculate Conception. She's the nemesis of Lucifer under the title of Seat of Wisdom. She's the nemesis of Beelzebub. By the way, those three are the same. Beelzebub, Lucifer, and Beelzebub are the same guy. She's the nemesis of him under the title of the Immaculate Heart. Baal, it's the Immaculate Heart. But when you look at the saints, one of the ones that, the only time I've ever had a case that had Satan as a possessor that I actually thought he was telling the truth, because usually when they say I'm Satan, I'm like, yeah, I've seen him and you ain't him, all right? So they try and bluff you to make you feel, oh, we're Legion, yeah, okay. There's just one of you, isn't there? You know, that kind of thing. But the nemesis, one of the nemeses of Satan, this was a very fascinating, the nemesis of Satan in this particular case was Saint Joan of Arc. And the reason it was Saint Joan of Arc is because in this case, God was revealing that Satan was the inciter of treason through ambition. Let that sink in. It's the problem we have in our church, and it's the problem we have in our government. They are selling out the church for ambition, and they're selling out our country for ambition. That's a fascinating thing. And the reason she became the nemesis of him under that specific aspect is because the bishop who put her to death was doing so, he was committing treason by siding with the English, and he was French, in order to get a bigger bishopric. And yet and in fact, it's very fascinating. In the rehabilitation trials of St. Joan of Arc, it's recounted how one time she was asked, what's the one thing that you feared? They said, you're fearless, when she would go into battle. And they said, what do you fear? And she said, treason. Interesting, right? So it just depends on the particular Saint Catherine of Alexandria, as I mentioned. There's a number of different ones. It just depends on the particular demon that you're dealing with. So there's been a lot of them. I always tell people being an exorcist is like being on the receiving end of a sewer pipe, right? Because you're just dealing with garbage all the time, right? And some of it's the level of depravity. God does give the grace to the exorcist to not be scarred by it, but sometimes the levels of depravity that are revealed and the evil of the demons in their fall is so profound at times that sometimes there's been a couple that were revealed to me, and it took me a while to process it, just to be able to kind of clear my mind and how evil it was. So, but what happens though is, being on the receiving end of a sewer pipe, sometimes women who are washing dishes lose their ring, then it goes down the drain, and so you get these little gems floating down the sewer pipe, right? And it's the same thing with exorcism. It's a sewer pipe, but the interesting part of it isn't even the demons. As you can see from the way I've talked, the real interesting thing is what you learn about Our Lady or the saints or God. That's what's interesting. So when people say, what's the most, bizarre and fascinating thing you've seen, look, demons are boring. They do the same stuff over and over again. What's interesting is what you hear about our Lord and Our Lady or some saint.
My friend is a Christian in another denomination and practices demon deliverance and casting out of demons. She constantly wants to pray over me and my children. Do I need to be concerned about this? She lives in another state.
I've actually seen people who don't have authority praying over people. Actually, the person themselves who prayed became possessed, and also the person who was being prayed over became possessed. And the reason being is because they don't have authority. Now, demons operate entirely under an authority structure. Let's back up and explain this a little bit, because this gives an indicator of how people have to understand this. When the angels were created, God, as I mentioned, they had this perfect comprehension. But at that same moment of creation, God then infused all of the essences of all of created things that would ever exist. So literally, if an angel wants to understand what a dog is, it just has to think about a dog and about dogness, his concept of dogness, and he fully comprehends everything there is to understand about a dog instantaneously. Boom, right? And so, but part of that is God also infused in them the conceptual knowledge of the natural law, and that's part of the natural law is the authority structure that God has established. And that means that they understand exactly where the lines of demarcation are between authority and not authority. They know exactly where that is at, and they're legalists. We call them lawyers from hell, right? They know exactly where that line is. And so you step over it. If you act outside your authority, you become subject to them because that's disordered. It's called the sin of usurpation. This is what happened with Eve. When she actually ate the fruit, the fathers of the church tell us that when Eve ate the fruit, what happens is she stepped outside a twofold authority. The first is she stepped outside the authority of God, who said, don't eat the fruit. But then the fathers also say that Eve was not told directly by God to not eat the fruit. She was told by Adam, and God had told Adam. And so when she stepped out, when she ate the fruit, she stepped outside the authority structure in relationship to Adam as well. The two principal functions of authority are to provide and to protect. And that meant that Eve stepped outside the protection of her husband. This is why I tell women, if you try and control your husband, that's usurpation, and you're stepping outside, and this is why you're going to get whacked, right? And this is one of the reasons why I just tell people, if you look at the curse of Eve and you look at all the things that Eve wanted, like self-sufficiency and this and that, independent of Adam, if you look at the modern feminist movement, it's just the curse of Eve on steroids, right? So, and how do we know is the women are miserable. You know, you get these women who are really strong feminists and they're just miserable. They're not happy, right? Okay. So why am I going into this? Someone like that who wants to pray over you, they don't have authority over you. And as a result of that, you are entering into a disordered situation and the demons can get involved. They don't always, because God will block them in many cases. But I just tell people, look, unless it's a priest, don't have him pray over you, except under one circumstance. Parents can pray over their children, basically. And the husband can pray over his wife. But that's it. Outside of that, you're acting contrary to the authority structure and you're going to get attacked. A lot of times people that do that will say, well, I'm not being attacked. All you have to do is ask them one question. What's your family life like? Because what happens is, if they can't attack the individual, they move laterally and start attacking their family.
Can you speak to the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation when reconciliation isn't possible, as in case of an abuser?
So forgiveness is letting loose of the actual debt, and that the person of justice that the person owes you, whereas reconciliation is resumption of common life. So when we're reconciled to God through the sacrament of penance or through confession, what's happened is if we've cut ourselves off, we don't have common life with him. And so then what happens is once we're restored to that, then God, and we're restored to grace, God infuses his dwelling in us, and so we engage in that common life, and that's what the reconciliation ultimately is. We have this idea that, this is one of the reasons why we say that ultimately healing is reconciliation with God, because what it's doing is it's reordering our faculties so that we can have that perfect communion with God, right? So that being said, in relationship to abuser, you must always forgive them for no other reason than for your own sake. It doesn't mean that you resume common life. And by that, we mean that has to be governed by prudence. And there's two parts to it. The one is, as St. Thomas says, he said that, you have to have charity for everybody, but it doesn't mean that you extend the effects of charity to some people, because if you do that, it's just going to make them more entrenched in their sin. Well, if you start in relationship to the abuser, if you just automatically just reconcile, you're just going to confirm him in his abuse, right? And so that's not good for him. It's contrary to his good. But then, and that's why you still have to forgive the person, you pray for them and do whatever, but you don't necessarily have common life until they change. And then, as a matter of charity, the common life, that's when the reconciliation would occur. If you're talking about, but on the side of the individual who is hurt, then it's also a prudential matter. If you need to heal, well, you can't have the person who's wounding you constantly at you, right? And so as a result, you can't resume common life until you heal fully as well. Now, this is true primarily in relationship to grave woundedness. If it was true in relationship to just minor wounds, well, then no people could be married, right? And so so when it comes to minor things, they have to be willing to work those things out and heal and forgive the person and have that reconciliation. And in that particular case, the reconciliation can actually help the other person to stop the abuse or stop the thing. But if you're talking about grave abuse, it's just governed by a different set of principles.
How can we best offer reparation for sins against the beauty of Mary, and how can we comfort her through her sorrows?
Part of it is just meditating on them and also making acts of love of her and of love of God, obviously. Also doing little acts of reparation. So if someone blasphemes Our Lady's name, then, say, blessed is the name of Mary, or what have you, do the divine praises in opposition to it. The other thing we have to recognize about Our Lady is because her heart is so consumed with God. A demon once said to me, he said, to love one is de facto to love the other. So if you love Our Lady, de facto you're loving God. And if you love God, it means de facto you're going to love Our Lady. This is one of the problems with Protestantism, right? You have to wonder, how much love of God do they really have that they hate Our Lady? It's just weird, right? We know that's not true. In fact, then he said, to make reparation to one is to make reparation to the other. So if we make reparation to Our Lady by doing some penance or something in order to, and we give that to Our Lady, and also if we do some act contrary to that in order to make it up to her, that will make the reparation. But also just making reparation to her son itself is making reparation to her as well.
Do Catholics have any business patronizing the modern entertainment industry? Music, movies, Disney, etc.
Okay. No, I'm just trying to determine how in-depth of an answer do I actually give. Well, let me just say this. If you look at the way the industry has shifted, especially in the last 50 to 70 years, it's always had these tendencies. Here I'm thinking specifically of the film industry, also of the music industry. I'm going to mention something about music that you might find interesting. But the fact is that they've gone into a trajectory where many of the things that they do are simply offensive to God. That doesn't mean all of it is. Film and music and the various forms of media are not evil in themselves. It's whether they use them in an evil way or they've intentionally introduced evil into it. So the internet is not an evil thing in itself, but the evil use of the internet has become a huge problem. So the statistic is that the most conservative statistic I've read is that 35% of what goes through, I've seen as high as 50%, but 35% of what goes through the internet is pornography. Yeah. This is one of the reasons I say God's going to pull the plug on our infrastructure just to shut that off for a little while. But it also means that when it comes to film and music, then you have to judge whether you should watch something or participate in it based on the principle of the integral good. And so I have a whole book on the principle of the integral good, and I actually have a homily which I gave on music and things like that. And basically it boils down to the principle of the integral good states that the good is from an integral cause and evil is from any defect whatsoever. What does that mean? It means that something is good only if the whole thing is good. If there's something evil in a thing, then that means that the thing is evil, right? And so this is actually true even of our own moral actions. If I decide I'm going to do exercise, which is a good thing because I want to lose weight or what have you, I'm going to do some exercise, and and the intention is, I'm even going to offer this exercise up for Bessie Sue because she's having problems. But then I do it contrary to my parents who say, no, you can't exercise because after 10 o'clock. Then just the fact that I do it at that time renders the whole exercise bad. Right? And this is, as human beings, we're getting to the point where we're dividing everything, and because we become so sinful, as I mentioned, in sin, we separate out the evil and only focus on the good, and we become so habituated in that, we're like, well, no, this is good. No, when you take it in its totality as a whole, it's bad. And how do we know this? Well, you might have somebody who's, might have beautiful eyes, and they might have a beautiful mouth, but if their nose is missing, you're not going to say they're beautiful, right? It's the same principle here. And so if and then in relationship to the media, there's a distinction between sins that can be simulated and sins that cannot be simulated. There are certain sins that cannot be simulated. You can't simulate nudity. You can't simulate immodesty. It just is. And so if you watch things that contain those things, you are guilty of that. If you're volitionally do so, you're guilty of that level of sin. It's the same thing when they use God's name in vain and things of this sort. And so you're guilty of that. I'll give you an example. And this, if you just look at it this way, you can see how God sees it. See, we keep looking at everything from our point of view, and we're not looking at it from reality, which is his point of view, right? If someone sent a husband an audio tape that made fun of his wife, right, and called her a derogatory name, and he found it funny, right, she would be offended, right, in the very fact that this guy did this thing that is offensive to her. But if her husband kept that recording, and he kept playing it over and over again because he got a certain amount of entertainment out of it, every single time he presses that button, she's offended. Why do we think that every single time we don't do that in relationship to the media that we watch or the films that we watch, that God isn't offended? Think of that. Every time you press the button knowing there's vulgarities and profanities in a movie, he's offended every time, whether you think it or not. And this is what we have to keep in mind, and this means it's going to be restricted. There's another aspect to this too, and that is one of the things that we're seeing is in social media and things like that, which, by the way, again, aren't evil in themselves. They can actually perform a tremendous good. But what's happening now is the social media is resulting in what we call internet courage. People will say things online they would never say to your face, right? And it's kind of ridiculous because it's usually, you see this, the demographic is 25 to 35. It's young men. They usually have a problem with porn, and they're sitting on there. They think they know a little bit about the Catholic faith. They're running around criticizing and calling everybody names, and they think it's funny and cute. You know, it's like one guy sent me a meme. Actually, it was Mike Tyson, of all people, said that, you know, people do that on the internet because they know they can get away with it, but if they got punched in the face for it every time they did it, they would stop doing it. Right? I mean, it's a bit graphic, but that's the point. And what's happened, okay, so why did I go into that? We're also seeing people becoming wounded in two ways through the media. Again, it's not evil. In fact, if you read my book in psychology, I talk about how it can actually be healing, but obviously we're doing things that are causing damage. The social media, people are trolling each other and saying very hurtful things to each other, so people are being wounded just by reading this stuff. You see this really among teenagers. Right? The second part of it is it's habituating our faculties to things that are disordered. And that habituation, and so we're getting delight out of these things. It's sad that at the advent of the time in which the news media and the film industry were able to create works of art that were so well done that they engross us, is the very time that all the garbage gets introduced in. Right, and so, but the problem is then what it does is that people say, well, it was a good movie. Really? She slept with 5 different guys. How's that a good movie? Right? Oh, I'm not talking about that. Well, I am, because it's not a good movie, right? It might be artistically well executed. That doesn't make it a morally good movie, but people don't pay attention to that because they're so engrossed in the artistic goodness rather than in its moral goodness. And so what's happening is it's habituating us into, again, separating reality out, that is the evil from the good, and only focusing on the good, and it's dumbing us down. We're just getting stupid by watching this stuff. And so one of the things that we do, we put people on a prayer prescription, and when they come to us and they're possessed and they need help, first thing we do is tell them no internet, no computer, and no phone. Not because they're evil, but because they're not moderated. People don't moderate themselves in relationship to this stuff either, because it gives us a pleasure. There was a philosopher named Vogelin who said that we get a pleasure just out of the use of technology. And he said, as a result, we have to do some type of penance in order to counteract the intemperance that can arise if we continue using this thing. We see this. I mean, they already know. They've done the brain studies. Every time you get this little cling and you get a little text, there's a dopamine rush, right? We know this, right? And that means that we have to moderate this thing and keep it down to where we're only doing it, and it's disordering our faculties. It's also just about part of the dumbing down. I'll end with this because this is one of these topics. I could give a whole conference on this, as you can see. Is the fact that when they first started measuring what they called electronic amnesia was 15 years ago. And basically what it was is they were measuring how long it was between the time somebody looked something up on the internet and they forgot it. It was 15 seconds. 7 years ago, it was down to 11 seconds. It's now down to 7 seconds. That's how stupid we're getting, right? Okay, go ahead.
Is it just as efficacious to pray silently as it is to pray out loud?
Well, the entire tradition of this church says it depends on the nature of the prayer. Obviously, if you're doing meditation, obviously, which is a higher form of prayer. But if you're talking about some type of vocal prayer or subvocalization, which we do in our minds, they usually say that it's again depending on the circumstances. But all things being equal, when we say it out loud, we give glory to God, not just internally, but also externally through our bodies, and as a result, it's an increase in merit.
I have some wood carvings and furniture carved by my great-grandfather who was a Freemason. Is it possible that he said some sort of charm that remains in these objects? What should I do with them? He made carvings for many churches, mostly Protestant. Thank you.
Okay, there's a difference between the current Freemasonry and historic Freemasonry. Historic Freemasonry, they normally didn't do that. They just bought stuff. The only thing you had to worry about in the past with historic Freemasonry was if you had their hats or their emblems or their aprons and all that jazz. Like we told people, you have to burn the stuff or the medals. You had to get rid of those. And so usually you didn't have to worry so much about the things that you would inherit from them, although you do have to somewhat be careful because sometimes they got those things through fraud, and so it kind of has spiritual baggage. So there's that. I'm not necessarily saying that you have to get rid of it. If you're not noticing any problems in your house, I wouldn't worry about it. But the current Freemasonic stuff has changed, it's shifted. The people that are entering Freemasonry now are Satanists, not all of them, but they're actual Satanists. Now, Freemasonry is Luciferian, which is not the same thing as Satanism. Luciferianism is the practice in which people become their own gods. Scientology is actually Luciferian. And in fact, Dianetics by L. Ron Hubbard is Luciferian. In fact, if you read the book, I'm not necessarily recommended, there's a book called Turn Off Your Mind by the drummer of Blondie. And in that book, he recounts the fact that L. Ron Hubbard had a homosexual affair with Aleister Crowley, who taught him, do what thou wilt is the whole of the law, which is the cornerstone to Satanism. And so what he did is he just chopped out the whole of the law, and do what thou wilt became the cornerstone to Dianetics. It's Luciferianism. That's why they're so weird, right? So, but Freemasonry, as you go ascend to the top, it's a slow reveal that they're actually Luciferian at the top. But what's happened is that because Freemasons have so much impact and so much influence, and because it's a way to network, Satanists are entering into it, and they are slowly shifting Freemasonry over to Satanism, where Satanism is where Satan is actually worshipped. So you're seeing that slow shift. So if it's from something more recently, I would just get rid of it, just to be safe.
To what extent is a parent's authority over his grown children with regard to deliverance prayers?
So the basic way it works is that this authority structure is designed that parents have authority over their minor children. So both the husband and the wife have the ability to command demons, because they have the authority over their children, to command the demons to actually leave in relationship to their children, the minor children. Once they've reached the age of majority, there is a bit of a shift. The mother no longer has authority over the children once they reach the age of majority. She can still command the demons to leave, but it's under a different aspect, which I'll talk about here in a minute, so it's not in relationship to her authority. The father, in relationship to the sons, no longer has authority over his children once they reach the age of majority, and so that he no longer has the ability to command them to leave based upon his authority as father as such. Again, he can command the demons to leave, but from a different reason. The minor daughters are a different matter. The entire tradition of the church stated that according to the natural law, daughters, once they reached the age of majority, were still under the headship of their father until they either married or took vows. And this was in order to protect her honor. And this is why St. Thomas says that the principal aspect of the sin of fornication is it's an injustice against the father to protect the daughter's virtue. It's primarily a sin of injustice, not intemperance, he said, although intemperance is part of it. And so once she does that, then he passes that. We actually know this is the case. It's actually in a ritual I'm sure all of you seen numerous times. The father brings the daughter up, not the mother. The father brings the daughter up to the altar rail at her wedding. The groom is standing at the altar rail. The daughter's face is veiled, which is an indicator that nobody has bodily rights in relationship to my daughter, right? And that's his way of protecting her bodily integrity in relationship to her virtue. He brings her up veiled. He gets to the front, and then he lifts the veil, and that's an indicator to the groom, you can now contract bodily rights in relationship to my daughter, which means after you're married, then you can engage in the conjugal act and have common life with her. Then he takes her hand, right hand, and passes it to him as a passing of headship. That's what that ritual was. It's been part of the church for millennia. And that's why, because it actually is a revealing of this natural law structure that's understood. Okay. In fact, historically, there were only 2 women that lived outside their home other than those who were married and were under vows. Excuse me. And that was a woman past childbearing age who was a widow, or a woman of ill repute. Historically, that's the way it was. Okay. In fact, if you watch the movie The Quiet Man, that's actually what's taking place there. She says, I can't marry you because my brother won't allow it. Well, what does that mean? Well, the father has died, and that means the headship passes to the next in line, right? And so that's that natural law structure. However, we have obligations of the 4th commandment. So the children still have the obligation to honor their parents. So before they reach the age of majority, children have to obey, and the rights of the parents are in relationship to command. The parents have the right to command the kids, and the kids have an obligation to obey. After that, the parents' rights shift to counsel. They still have a right to counsel the child, hey, this is what you can and cannot do, you shouldn't be doing this or doing that, because of the honor that they owe to them, and if they do something bad, it takes away from the honor of the family, of the parents. And so they still have that right. Because of that duty, or that right, it means there's duties in relationships to parents and children. So parents would still have obligations to the children if, like, say, one of the boys reached the age of majority, went out and worked, and then he got injured and he couldn't take care of himself, then the parents would have an obligation out of justice to take care of the child. Okay, this is a long-winded answer, but it's very key. That means, therefore, that they can command the demons to lead in relationship to their children who've reached the age of majority even after they've left the house, because of this obligation of the 4th commandment. The children have obligations in relationship to take care of their parents should they need so, whether in their old age and infirmity, and they have an obligation, or whether financially if they need it, they have that obligation. And so children have a right to command the demons to leave their parents, not because they have authority over them, but because of this obligation. And siblings also have a mutual obligation because of the 4th commandment, and therefore can command the demons to leave in relationship to this. So this is a key thing. This is important because I tell children, especially if one of your parents is dying and doesn't want to see a priest, start saying binding prayers against any demon that's keeping him from seeing a priest. And very often, usually within a day or 2, he'll see a priest. And so this is something and kids can do it for their parents, parents can do it for their kids, and the siblings can do it for each other.
All right, we're going to do 3 more questions. Could you speak to the effects of pornography on the individual that views it? Is possession possible? And what effects does one member have of the family having and viewing pornography to the home environment, marriage, and individual family members? May it also have an effect on others within the home?
Well, first is to the first part of the question, does it harm the individual who views it? Actually, it does. They actually know through brain studies that pornography slowly actually causes an atrophy or certain problems in the brain itself over the course of time. It also causes disordering of the faculties in the sense that the women are viewed under a specific aspect or the men are viewed under a specific aspect, which is not connected to reality. And so over the course of time, the person's faculties become focused on those particular aspects of people, which is not the person. The person's the totality of those things, not just one particular bodily organ or what have you. And so there's this, what happens is the faculties become more and more disordered. Two, as St. Thomas says, because the pleasure is so vehement, what happens is that it basically causes the lower faculties to be confirmed in something that's morally illicit, and that means that your emotions and appetites become stronger and more inclined towards sin. So you're actually causing yourself damage in the process just by watching it. In relationship to the spiritual warfare, once that stuff gets into your mind, it's stored in your memory, and that means the demons can make use of it going forward. So it doesn't matter that you confess it, it's still a landmine that you have to constantly navigate. And ultimately, you have to ask Our Lady for the grace of forgetfulness so that you don't remember that stuff. But it's something that the demons can use for the rest of your life against you. There's that. I mean, there's a whole aspect to that. So you're causing yourself an awful lot of damage. In relationship to the family life, then what ends up happening is let's back up. Can you become possessed? You can become possessed through any mortal sin whatsoever. Even I knew a woman who became possessed through a mortal sin of pride. The demon tempted, she was a virtuous woman, and the demon said that it was tempting her by saying, "You're better than everybody else." She took the bait, boom, he got in. I've seen people become possessed through fornication. Usually people become possessed because they're involved in some type of, if you're talking about their sin causing the possession, they become possessed because of their own sinful behavior, usually in the area of the first commandment. They're engaging in the occult or something of that sort. But we're seeing a rise of possession for men watching, particularly men, although it does happen with women too. We're seeing a rise in possession among men from viewing pornography because of the fact that the Satanists have talked to people that, and actually the Satanists are involved as well in the pornography industry, which is why they actually say that by the time a woman reaches her mid-30s, she's just shot physically from all the bizarre things that they do. And it's because they see these people as nothing. They have no sense of life or human dignity. But the point being is that the Satanists have got involved, and they know that if you curse the master copy of the video that you make, the subsequent copies that are made bear the curse, and so the people who view it can be subject to the curse. They're doing this in Hollywood, by the way, and they're also doing it with music. I guarantee you've experienced that part in the music at some point. And this is how you did it. How many of you have ever gone in, you don't have to raise hands because it's by all of you anyway. How many of you have gone into a department store and they're playing a form of music that you normally don't listen to because it's bad music, you don't like it anyway, but you come out of the store and you can't get that jingle out of your head, right? Say a binding prayer and you will notice it'll stop immediately. It's actually a form of demons trying to initiate diabolic obsession. Okay, and it's because they've cursed the master copies of this music, because this was taught to them in the film industry and also in the music industry. The Satanists taught them this methodology, right? And so we're seeing a large number of guys, not large, that's not right. We're seeing an increase in the number of guys becoming possessed precisely because of the fact that they are viewing pornography that's cursed. So, and then, if they're viewing pornography, if he's the head of the household, if the husband's viewing it, he, as head of the household, his job is to provide and to protect. So he's the one who ultimately lets in his household anything that's spiritually good or bad. So he's letting the demons in by just viewing the pornography, and once he gets in, then it starts afflicting the children. I've seen this happen, where the husband was viewing things that had a very specific kind of a disorder, and then the son, who never saw this stuff, they led a normally chaste life within the context and a modest life in the context of the family. And all of a sudden, the kid, who's 9 years old, is confessing temptations to that specific kind of disorder. That's how demons get in and start picking, and that's how they get passed through the generational line. So I tell guys, you have to stop it. The other thing is, you cause tremendous damage in a relationship. Every woman, I don't care what the story is, every woman whose husband views pornography feels like her husband is emotionally unfaithful. And now you've got that damage to repair, so you just have to stop it. Okay.
If a house was infected by unclean spirits due to a possessed person living there, does the house still contain those unclean spirits even after the person departed? What should one do?
It depends. If the people bring it into the house and they're there long enough, a lot of times they can also gain access and get control in the house. And so if they leave and the stuff continues in the house, then you just have a priest come in. There's exorcisms that they can do to clean it up, and you don't have to be an exorcist to do that. So they clean it up. Although a lot of times when the people leave, the demon leaves with them. So if you move in and there's no problem. On the other hand, as an exorcist, I started doing this once I became an exorcist, but I tell priests to do this. You know, really when you go into a house, you're blessing people's house when they first move in, you really should just do a minor exorcism before you do the house just to clean it out. If for no other reason, it's better to be safe than sorry.
And last question, how can you heal from wounds that you cannot or can only barely remember? For example, the loss of a parent at a very early age or something like childhood sexual abuse. Is it necessary to remember yourself or be told about these things by others?
That's primarily a psychological question, and it depends on the circumstances. In the psychologists, the healthcare professionals that we work with that actually follow a Thomistic point of view in their healthcare work, which means they don't follow the modern models. Sometimes they will go back there. Once a person reaches a certain level of virtue and healing, what they'll do is they'll help the person to go back and begin processing those specific things. A lot of times it's not so much, although there are times, it's not so much going back and healing in those moments, although there's some that you do have to go back and heal the memories, as they say. But there are certain times, like in a situation like that, if you just never had your mother around, then what happens is that you, the father can compensate to some degree, but the father isn't the mother, and mother isn't the father. And so this basically means that a lot of times what I do is I encourage people, well, then what you need to do is find a mother that you can have a mother-daughter or mother-son-like relationship with that's rightly ordered, whether that's your grandmother or somebody else, because a lot of times that will begin the healing process. Now, sometimes people don't need to heal in relationship to those things, but sometimes they actually do.
Is it a sin to delay forgiving someone, whether it be minutes, hours, days, months, etc.?
There's two aspects to forgiveness. St. Thomas talks about this in the context of charity, but he basically says you have to have love of God for everybody, regardless of how evil, how much they're hurting you, but you have to have charity for them. He said there's a difference, however, between loving somebody from the point of view of charity and the effects of that love. So he even says that God even loves the demons in hell, but he doesn't extend any of the effects of his love to them. Okay. So the same thing is true about forgiveness. We have to forgive everybody. Christ himself said you have to forgive 7 times, 70 times. And that in the Jewish religion meant every time, all the time. You always have to forgive people interiorly. For our sakes, if for no other reason, you have to forgive it. If you don't forgive people, even the delay is going to continue to cause damage. So you have to be willing to forgive immediately. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you extend the effects of that forgiveness. So if a husband's beating his wife on a regular basis, well, she has to forgive him. But that doesn't mean that then she just lets him do whatever, or that she, doesn't take prudential means of keeping herself protected. So the effects of that forgiveness sometimes has to be delayed.
Does forgiving those who have hurt you require readmitting them to intimacy with you in friendship or otherwise?
So that's the second part. So sometimes if somebody's hurt you, so a lot of times what we'll do is we'll get people who come to us, and the reason they're possessed, so about 50% of the people that show up on our doorstep are women who have been raped, molested, sexually, psychologically, or physically gravely abused. And they're possessed as a result of this. Now, people say that's not fair, but there's a whole reason why God allows it. they can't go back into that situation, because then what happens is the wounds keep getting renewed. The person keeps sticking the knife in them, metaphorically speaking. And so what we have to tell them is, no, you have to keep your distance. You have to forgive the person and begin the healing process, and offer that up for this person's conversion. And then prudentially, if the person has a change of heart, then you admit them back in as a matter of charity. But if they don't, so that you don't get wounded again in a grave fashion, then you have to keep distance. Now here we're talking about grave woundedness. Obviously, just in family life, people are always picking at each other, right? So there's always a certain element of that. So you can't tell your wife, well, until you stop picking, I can't be around you. You can't do that. It has to be something in which it's something that's grave, and that it's ongoing, and it's clear it's going to continue to be ongoing. But if it's not, then we just have to be willing to suffer it well.
Can you be possessed if you take atonement of sins from someone who is possessed or oppressed?
It depends on the nature of how that is done. So if you offer yourself to be possessed, you can become possessed through that. And the technical term for that is called transference. The church strictly forbids it. However, they say you can offer up your sufferings for people and prayers for people who are possessed for their sake. And you can do atonement for something that might have caused the possession, etc., for their sake. You just have to make sure you're in a place spiritually where you can do that, because demons will often retaliate if they notice it's starting to have an impact on the possession. So you just have to make sure you're spiritually where you need to be.
How to heal my kids' hearts for the bad I have done. Discipline without love, being mean while I raise them.
One more time.
How to heal my kids' hearts for the bad I have done, such as discipline without love, being mean while I was raising them.
There's a few steps that have to be done. One is there are times in which the parents are literally going to have to, if it's really bad, the parents are going to have, and if the kids know it, they're going to have to ask their kids for forgiveness. That doesn't mean the kids have to immediately do it, but that's got to be the first step. The second step is that they have to start loving them in a rightly ordered way. And they have to be willing to suffer the kids lashing out at them, etc., because the kids are venting, right? And a lot of that is because of the fact that they're hurt and wounded. And so basically in that asking for forgiveness, you're correcting their view of you now, because you realize that they realize, okay, you're sorry for this. And then the love indicates that you're serious about trying to repair your relationship with them. And then that begins the groundwork for them being able to heal. You can also pray for them, do prayer, sufferings, and good works to merit the grace so that they are able to heal. The other part, which I haven't really talked too much about, is the fact that demons will pick at our woundedness. They know we're wounded. They can tell. They can see what happens to us, and then they just start picking at it by temptations and things of that sort. So one of the principal ways you can help people to heal is ask our Lord and Our Lady, A, to give the person the grace to heal, but also to block any demons or bind any demons from picking at the person, or picking at them from keeping them from healing, but also from them forgiving you for what you've done.
How do we distinguish between authentic demonic possession and other forms of mental illness? And what are the implications for our approach to pastoral care?
Okay. That's a whole lecture. In fact, I just spent 7 days with healthcare professionals and priests becoming exorcists, training them to see these are the patterns. If you don't know what you're looking at, the patterns look very similar between possession and psychological illness. But there are very distinctive patterns. That's why I wrote an 800 and some page book on parsing out these are how they're different. It's not in the lay version, which is Dominion. In the priest version, it's in there. And the reason we took all that stuff out is because we just didn't want people coming in and faking they were possessed and knowing how they're supposed to act, right? Okay. So there's distinctive psychological patterns. I'm not going to go into all of them, but the principal way that we actually know, before we get to the pastoral side of things, the principal way we know is through prayer, right? So, and that basically means if you pray over the individual, you're going to see a shift in patterns if they're possessed. If they're possessed, the more you pray over them, the worse it looks like it gets. And it actually isn't getting worse. In fact, one time this one woman said, I'm not going to go to sessions with Father Ripperger anymore. And the parents said, why? Well, the only time this guy ever shows up is when he's praying over me, right? That's the only time someone's forcing him to the surface, right? Okay. The point being is that the demon is going to start acting up because he's feeling the effect of his prayer. It's painful to him, and so eventually he's just going to start acting up more. So you'll see that it looks like a degradation in their condition, but it's actually a good thing because he's starting to feel it. But the principal way that we actually know it is through what they call the 3 preternatural signs. The first is things where the person speaks languages that they've never learned. So the first case of possession I ever had, the gentleman, he barely finished, I don't even think he finished high school now that I think of it. But when the demon manifests the first time, he spoke in a form of Phoenician that had been defunct for 3,500 years. Okay, that's not a psychological problem. The second, so that's one of the things. Sometimes you'll get, the demons will speak in specific language that the person's never heard. So one time I had this one demon. Christ restricts what languages they can speak in their situation. They have the infused knowledge of every language that's ever existed, so they know it perfectly. And so they can speak any language, if God permitting, but they're only permitted to speak certain languages usually. Once in a while, Christ gives them free reign, because every single thing they do is completely controlled by him, literally down to possession, who can possess, the degree of the possession, how they can manifest, all that. He completely controls all of it. But one time, this one case I had, the person, the demon was only permitted to speak in Latin. And my Latin is fairly good. I have a fluent knowledge of reading knowledge of it. I can hear it fairly well. But when it comes to speaking it, I always had to formulate the grammar. So what would happen is during the session, I would command him in Latin. And if I used the accusative case, when I was supposed to use the dative case, he would act like he didn't have to suffer this, right? So my grammatical errors he ignored. At a certain point, I'm like, hey, this guy's helping my grammatic skills. Okay, so that's an indicator that, and this person had never studied Latin, so those are one of the indicators. Sometimes you'll actually hear psychologists, they were saying this in the 70s, and it was just completely daft. They were saying things like, oh, well, maybe at some point they heard the language. Okay, do you know of anybody who can hear a language once and all of a sudden has perfect fluency? That's absurd. Right? It violates the principle of sufficient reason. I mean, it's just nutty, which we'd expect coming from psychologists. Okay. But so the second one is occult knowledge. There's things they just don't know. Now, there's 2 forms of occult knowledge. The first is that they'll tell you things, particular things that there's no way they could know. So they'll tell you things you did that morning, and there's no way they can know. So one case, a bishop was actually present, not in my case. He was present in another, so I'm giving another example. But the bishop was present, and the bishop had committed a venial sin that morning. And he hadn't gotten to confession. So the demon said, hey, you committed this sin. And then the demon said, but your problem is you repent as soon as you recognize it, right? I'm like, hey, that sounds like a pretty good bishop to me, right? Okay. So they can know particulars. The other one is they can have universal knowledge. So they can make theological statements that there's no way these people can know. Right, and so that's one of the ways that you can know it. The last is those things that are beyond human capacity. So that's when they'll change shape, literally change shape in front of you. And that's about 80 to 90% of what an exorcist sees is the person will actually change shape. And that we call it morphing. So they change shape, which is beyond the human capacity. They'll levitate, but levitation is not always a sign of possession, but when they do levitate in conjunction with other things, then you know the person's possessed. And that's why I tell people, well, look, levitation is not a psychological problem, right? So the church gives you things that when they're clear, they give you a clear indicator that the person's possessed and that it's not psychological. Those are what we call the primary signs. But then there's 57 categories of secondary signs that we can use to get at least an initial indicator that the person is probably possessed. But it's not until you actually see the demon manifest preternaturally that you know, okay, we know for certain the person's possessed. Pastorally, the best thing that I usually tell priests is you need to contact my lay assistant, because what we did is we designed a protocol. There's a whole story behind why we designed the protocol. But we set up this protocol. We put people on a specific prayer prescription, which slowly drives the demon to the surface. But it also can blow out lesser demons. So if the person's not possessed, it can get rid of the lower level kinds of things. And then if they are possessed, eventually there's a series of steps. Then once the demon manifests preternaturally, then we can get them to an exorcist, either locally or we'll take the case under certain circumstances, because that's what we do in our community. So that's it basically. So pastorally, though, one of the things that I tell people is that if you want to keep yourself protected from diabolic influence, but if you also want to blow it out in your own particular lives, is the pattern that we kept seeing over and over again is, as exorcists, especially in the last 5 years, was that liberations of the possession were revolving around either the incarnation or the passion, particularly the precious blood. And so we've just kind of noticed that pattern. And so in our prayer prescription, we have them doing the Angelus at 6, noon, and 6, and then also the prayers of the Auxilium Christianorum at 6, noon, and 6. And what we started to notice is that people who had diabolic oppression and obsession, it would slowly blow it out over the course of time, usually within about 2 to 3 months on its own. They didn't even need to see a priest. They didn't need to see an exorcist if they followed this prayer prescription. It even got rid of 2 cases in the last 2 years, got rid of people who were possessed on lower level forms of possession. And then in the other cases, it just drives the thing to the surface, and then they were able to get some help. But the pattern that we started to recognize is that even if people were going to Mass every Sunday and holy days, they were getting to confession regularly, they might even be saying the rosary every day, what we started to notice is that the pattern that the demons, that we kept seeing the attacks in, was a lack of elementary spiritual discipline. In other words, people were not practicing self-denial on a daily, consistent basis. And that's what this 6, noon, and 6. People would say, okay, you got to get up at 6. Can it be 7? No, it's got to be 6, right? And that practicing that self-denial basically blew it out. And so that's one of the reasons I tell people, look, and this is what we tell priests, okay, put them on this prayer prescription, and there's a few other things they need to do too. But that was the thing that would just start clearing out a tremendous amount of diabolic influence.
What are a couple recommendations you have for teenagers listening to you today?
Usually it's for parents. I usually tell parents, you need to say binding prayers. Oh, that brings up something that's very important. You need to say binding prayers every day for your kids. You should probably be blessing your house. Feed your kids a lot of exercise, water, and salt, right? So, no, as far as the teenagers go, I think it goes back to that discipline. What they really need to realize is that their goal is to have virtue. The fundamental goal of parents is to get their kid not through college. Their fundamental goal is to get their kid to the age of majority with sufficient virtue to assume the essential obligations of life. And that means they need to start studying the virtues and start developing them consciously. Okay, these are the virtues I need to work on, this is what I want to gain, etc. The other thing is that demons know, because when they were created, all angels were created, when they were created, all of the natures of all the things that would ever exist were infused into their intellect. That means that an angel just has to think of a dog and he fully, instantaneously exhausts everything there is to know about a dog, okay? That means that they also have a perfect knowledge of the authority structure as God designed it as part of the natural law, both in them and in us. And usually what I tell teenagers is, look, this is how this works. That authority structure, the two principal effects of authority, to provide and to protect. If you step outside the authority structure of your parents, you leave yourself open to diabolic attack, and you're going to get shellacked, right? And so I tell them what you really need to do is work on obedience in a rightly ordered fashion in relationship to your parents, and you're going to find that your interior life is going to be a lot quieter because the demons are going to be attacking you a lot less. One of the things I failed to mention in relationship to Our Lady of Sorrows is the fact that when St. Simeon said, your heart will be pierced that the hearts of many would be laid bare, or your soul should be pierced, sorry, so that the hearts of many would be laid bare. What he was telling us was that Our Lady, by going through the passion of Christ, would merit an intimacy with God that no one else would have. Now, we have this. There's things we tell our family, there's things we tell our friends that we won't tell other people. And that's kind of the way God is. So there's things that he communicates to her that he doesn't communicate to anybody else. But he will allow her to reveal them for the sake of drawing attention to her perfections, her amiability, all of that. And so I tell people, if you pray to Our Lady of Sorrows and ask, what is the predominant defect I need to work on? She'll give you the grace to see it. And then you can start working on it. The other way is ask your guardian angel, hey, what do I got to work on? Because your guardian angel deals with you all the time. I figure being a guardian angel is like trying to take care of a dog that's just out of control. Right? Don't do that, right? So, okay. But you can ask Our Lady of Sorrows to reveal it. She'll give you a grace, and then you can begin working on it, because we're very blind to ourselves, right? And this is true in relationship to virtue. But I also tell parents, you can ask Our Lady of Sorrows, reveal anything to me that I need to know that's going on in the lives of my children to help them. And that has a tremendous effect. Most parents, after about a week, are like, ooh, found out all sorts of stuff. Okay.
Can a person that was possessed ever become not possessed by the demon just deciding to leave?
No. I mentioned before that the who can possess, all those aspects of the possession are entirely determined by Christ. So when they come in and when they leave is entirely at his discretion. And so sometimes demons say, well, I'm going to stick around. Well, that's not your choice. You're here for as long as he wants you to do. I mentioned it just a little bit in that stage 5 of the 6 stages of liberation. There's a certain point where they go to God and they try and bargain, let me out. And God says no, which is an indicator they don't have control over when they get to leave. And so under normal circumstances, God wants some external agency to be involved for their being removed.
In regards to hexes or possible generational sins, how can you detect these? And can these types of sins cause multiple miscarriages and stillbirths within the same couple?
They can. There's a variety of things that can cause it. I mean, obviously there can be physiological causes for that, but there can also be diabolic causes. They can also block women from getting pregnant. So there's been a few women that we've prayed over that ended up pregnant within a month, right? So, which is interesting that God will allow them to actually do that. As far as the generational stuff, the miscarriage, if there's a pattern of it, that's usually an indicator that somewhere in their generational lineage is Freemasonry, and so they need to break their prayers to break the Freemasonic curse. Excuse me. It can also be the effect of somebody in their generational line has been cursed, and you happen to be part of that line. So sometimes those things can actually happen. There's all sorts of things you can do to kind of clean up your generational line. I actually have a conference on generational, I think there's 3 of them, generational spirits, and how to identify them, how to get rid of them. But the principal way to identify them is, again, to ask Our Lady of Sorrows, reveal to us what is the generational spirit within our family. It's tremendously effective. Usually she'll give you, and it's not always the thing you think it's going to be. So, for example, in one family, they had gargantuan problems with homosexuality, with fornication, with other pornography, with alcoholism and drug abuse. And the pattern I was seeing is it's a spirit of pride. And one of the people in the family was possessed. And as it turned out, the possessor said, well, there was this generational spirit that was introduced into the line of pride, and he wasn't the one, but he was one of them. And so that was in there. But it was from a generational spirit of pride. So a lot of times what you see the demons doing is not necessarily the problem. It's something else. And one of the ways you're going to know that, in addition to asking Our Lady of Sorrows, is you ask her, or not ask her, but what you can do is, if you start really working on a particular vice or difficulty in your family and it's very stubborn and you can't seem to get rid of it, that's usually an indicator that you're dealing with something else. And you need to ask Our Lady, what is that? And then once you go after the demon in that part of your family's lineage, it'll stop.
Is it true that we need to be careful of the things we say out loud, as the demons can use it against us? And how do we protect ourselves from them knowing how to attack us?
That's true, but I don't think you have to be worrying that much. The demons are watching us, right? The way they watch us is just to think about us, and they can just, everything that we're doing and everything that's happening in the entire universe is being infused in their minds as it happens. So if they want to know what's going on in Saturn, they can just think of Saturn and they see where the thing is at, and et cetera. It's the same thing with us. So they don't hear us, they just see what we're saying and things of that sort. There's, but I don't know if you have to worry too much about that unless you're talking about something which you're worried that the demons might make use of that information, which I do on occasion when we're talking to people who are possessed and we don't want the demons to know what our strategy is. But it's not necessarily going to happen in most people's lives. But the one thing that you can do is you can just ask Christ to bind the demon from hearing what you're saying. And basically what that means, it doesn't mean that what you're saying isn't infused in his mind. It's just that God blocks his will from being able to focus on it so he doesn't know what you're saying.
Should a person be concerned if their mother told them someone cursed them when they were born?
So the way demons work is they're showmen. They just can't stand hiding. Even when they hide, they want to show themselves a little bit here and there, right? And so usually what I tell people is if there's some particular aspect of your life that is an indicator that it could be diabolic, then you might want to go to a priest and see if you can, and have him pray over you to break the curse and see if there's any shift, right? If he prays over you and then nothing happens, well, then that's a sign he's not there. If you don't notice anything, then it's probably an indicator that he's not there.
How to protect children, especially those who have to go to public schools?
Yeah, that's a little rough. One of the principal ways is obviously giving them a full catechetical formation yourself, making sure they have it. Don't just send them to a Catholic school, don't have them just go to CCD. You have to make sure they understand all of the teachings of the Catholic faith and the moral teachings of it. And you also have to teach them that, look, what we believe and what we know is right and wrong isn't necessarily what other people are going to believe, so when you see that, don't get sucked into it. You just know that that's what other people do. The other thing is this elementary discipline. The common element that we saw among families that did not lose one of its family members to going off the rails spiritually or morally is the fact that they had engaged in this spiritual discipline throughout the course of the upbringing of the children. So praying the rosary can help quite a bit in that regard, but we found this discipline is the primary thing, so that if you give them an elementary discipline, it's easier for them to say no in relationship to those things. But I think that you just have to prepare them intellectually and psychologically, depending on their capacities of what they're going to be dealing with. It also means you got to be watching your public school like a hawk. So.
We will do 3 more questions.
Okay.
How do you combat or root out spiritual envy?
St. Thomas says that the principal way to overcome envy is through charity. And by that he means that as we tell God we love him on a regular basis, throughout the course of the day, tell him at regular intervals, I love you, you don't have to feel it, but over the course of time he's going to increase the charity, because envy is specifically against the spiritual goods that someone has. And as we grow in charity, we're going to be able to actually see those goods as good things, rather than, St. Thomas says, the reason we envy is because we see that this person possesses something that's good that we don't have, and that's seen as bad. So as we grow in charity, our focus is on God, and so we just have a greater appreciation for the fact that they actually have that. We'll take delight in the fact that they have those things, rather than thinking, okay, I don't have that, etc. So it's principally by really increasing your charity, that is, making sure you love God and you love your neighbor for the sake of God. And as you do that, over the course of time, the envy will just evaporate.
Can you elaborate on the title of Mary as Mirror of Justice?
Yeah, so the mirror of justice, as I mentioned, the principal way in which we know that is that she because of her perfect sacrifice. But it also meant that she also had a perfect understanding and the grasp of the structure of justice and what was due to people. So even in her own life, she was always perfectly just to everybody. And so this is one of the reasons, too, why even when people are damned, she looks at that and says, well, this is perfectly just. So there's a variety of different aspects of what justice is. So if you look at the various kinds of justice, you see that she fulfills each individual aspect of that justice, where she gives people their due. She actually she doesn't keep things from people that Christ wants, etc. But the principal way that she's just is in relationship to God, always giving him his due.
In the talk, you spoke about sessions that you do. What is the best way to get a session with you?
Well, I'll give you an idea of it. On average, we have between 6,000 and 8,000 requests per year. So when that started happening, I said, well, obviously we can't vet all these people. So we set up this program in order to maximize the people that needed to see us and minimize the number of people that didn't need to see us. So we just didn't see them, right? And so we began this process of it. And so usually what I tell people is, well, the first step is to contact us at info@delawrence.org. And then my lay assistant, who's done exorcisms for about, he's not done, he's assisted at exorcisms for about 25 years. He's the guy that begins the process of putting people through a specific protocol, because the diocese, and when we went there, we entered into agreement that this is how we were going to proceed. And so the best thing to do is just contact him, and then he'll begin the process of it. If you begin the process, by the time you see me, it's somewhere between 4 to 6 months later. So, and it's just, and what that does is that means that the priests in our society really only see authentic cases of possession. All the other cases get rooted out beforehand. But a lot of times you don't necessarily need to see me. You just need to go through this process, and that'll clear out the demons in the process.
Thank you, Father.
You're welcome. If you'll kneel, I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti descendet super vos et manet semper.